Picture the most watched man in the world, shrunk to a damp house on a wind-scoured rock in the South Atlantic. May 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte is dying. The British say it's cancer. Rumors insist it's poison. A century later, scientists test his hair, and find arsenic. Tonight, we slow everything down. What exactly happened on that island? What did the doctors see? And why does his hair hold a deadly secret that may not be a murder at all? We begin with the island itself, Saint Helena. Think steep green cliffs dropping into a restless sea, rain sliding sideways across open ground, and wind that never quite quits. When Napoleon arrived after Waterloo, he was no longer the thunderbolt of Europe. He was a guarded prisoner. His home, Longwood House, sat on a plateau that collected mist and damp like a sponge. The rooms were drafty. The ceilings sweated. The wallpaper, so fashionable in Britain, peeled at the corners. The place looked, and smelled, like a slow fever. Life there ran on rules. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, allowed walks, then shortened them, then allowed them again, tracking distances and companions like a meticulous bookkeeper. Guards watched the pathways. Letters were opened. Visitors were counted. Meals arrived lukewarm. Disputes about etiquette replaced diplomacy. Imagine the most controlling office manager you've ever had, but give him an island and a fleet. Within this small world, Napoleon tried to build a routine that felt like command. He rose late, dictated memoirs, played cards, quarreled over wine, quibbled over the exact placement of furniture. He staged nostalgia as if it was strategy. But the body that had survived campaigns from Italy to Russia began to pull away from him. At first, the complaints sounded ordinary: fatigue, a tight ache under the ribs, sour stomach after meals. Then came the sharper edges: nausea that woke him before dawn, vomiting that burned the throat, a steady loss of appetite. He started leaving food untouched. The waste that once filled a uniform thinned. Servants noticed he favored the left side when sitting, as if any pressure on the upper abdomen hurt. He had days of relief, then setbacks that were worse. By 1817, everyone in Longwood could see it: the emperor was failing. Doctors rotated through Longwood like minor characters in a play with no hero. Some prescribed rest and bland food, others prescribed the fashion of the age: purges and emetics. Calomel, a mercury compound, was a common remedy. Antimonial preparations appeared. Laudanum eased pain and dulled the edges. None of it cured anything. The treatments fit the period's logic: if the body is imbalanced, force it back with powerful substances. But many of those substances were themselves chronic insults to a weakened stomach. Outside, the climate helped nothing. Longwood's famous damp didn't just cling to clothes, it got into walls and onto paper. Books mildewed. Hangings sagged. The wallpaper, colored with a fashionable green pigment, absorbed that moisture and hosted mold. Windows let in wind more than sunlight. On bright days, the air could be crisp and fresh; on most days, it was a catalogue of drafts. By 1818 and 1819, the symptoms formed a distinct pattern. He complained of gnawing pain in the upper abdomen. Meals triggered discomfort. He had bouts of vomiting without the watery diarrhea that often marks acute chemical poisoning. At times, he brought up coffee-ground material, old blood from the stomach. The weight continued to drop, his face hollowed, and his energy crashed. There were mornings he could dictate a few pages and afternoons when a few steps left him spent. He knew something was wrong. He also knew his father had died relatively young with what the family called stomach illness. Relatives, too, had histories that sounded similar. In that era, nobody spoke the word cancer the way we do now. They described symptoms, not categories. But the pattern: pain after eating, weight loss, vomiting, later signs of bleeding, fits a grim modern picture. In early 1821, the decline accelerated. On good days he took short rides. On bad days he lay still and spoke in fragments. He asked for iced drinks, then rejected them. He requested chicken, then turned away. He dozed more, woke less. Those around him wrote about a sense of sinking. He began to say goodbye, not with a dramatic speech, but by settling accounts, this item to that servant, this request for his son, this last look out a window he'd grown to hate. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died at age 51. The next day, British and French doctors gathered for the examination. If you imagine a pristine surgical suite, erase it. This was a table, rough light, and hands that knew anatomy by experience. They opened the abdomen and found what generations of medical students would be taught to recognize, a stomach in a catastrophic state. The mucosal surface, the inner lining, was not a simple ulcer but a large, ulcerated area extending near the pylorus, with thickened walls suggesting a long, serous, infiltrative process. Parts of the stomach adhered to surrounding tissues, scarred down, stuck to the liver. In places the tissue was friable. There was evidence of bleeding. To the doctors of 1821, this was the face of advanced gastric cancer. To modern eyes, it still looks that way. They wrote their conclusion plainly: stomach cancer with ulceration and hemorrhage caused the death. The case seemed closed. Then science happened, slowly, and out of sequence. Hair locks from famous people were cherished in the 19th century. Bits of Napoleon's hair, snipped by attendants and admirers, survived in envelopes and lockets for decades. In the 20th century, some of those strands were tested for arsenic. The results, high levels, higher than what we'd expect in an unexposed modern person. The numbers were sensational enough to launch a new story: Napoleon had been poisoned. It's easy to fall in love with the plot. A confined emperor. A harsh governor. Loyalists and enemies within a few rooms. Arsenic, the poison of choice in powdered form, tasteless, colorless, deadly. But the allure of a story isn't the same as proof. Let's walk toward the evidence like we're building a case for court. First, timing. Arsenic levels were elevated not just in hair from the very end of Napoleon's life, but also in samples dated to years before Saint Helena. That matters. If the levels had spiked only in his last months, we might imagine a single poisoner. When the elevation appears across earlier years, the plot looks less like a crime and more like an environment. Second, symptoms. Acute arsenic poisoning, the kind delivered to kill, typically tears through the gastrointestinal tract. It produces violent vomiting and profuse watery diarrhea, often described as rice water stools, severe dehydration, profound weakness, sometimes a shock-like collapse. Skin changes, neuropathic burning in the hands and feet, and a distinct sweet garlic odor on the breath may appear. Napoleon's long decline does not read like that. He had vomiting, yes, but not the extreme purging and catastrophic fluid loss of an acute arsenic attack. His course unfolded across years, with pain after meals, weight loss, and bleeding, exactly the slow, cruel tempo of a growing stomach cancer. Third, the autopsy. If we strip away rumor and look only at the anatomy, the stomach findings match cancer remarkably well: thickened walls, ulcerated tumor, adhesions to the liver, and evidence of hemorrhage. Arsenic can damage the stomach lining, but it does not reliably produce a serous, infiltrative mass stuck to adjacent organs. Cancer does. So why the arsenic in the hair? Because the 19th century whispered arsenic from every corner. Arsenic-based pigments were fashionable. Scheele's green, copper arsenite, made wallpapers and fabrics glow with a vivid, expensive green. In damp houses, molds can colonize those pigments. Under certain conditions, microorganisms can convert inorganic arsenic to volatile organoarsenicals, which off-gas into the room. The names are less important than the idea: the wallpaper itself becomes a low, steady source of arsenic exposure. Not enough to kill someone outright. Enough to measure in hair. Now add medicines. Pharmacology in Napoleon's day lived in a haze of heavy metals. Calomel, a mercurous chloride compound, was dosed for constipation and biliousness. Antimonial potions were used to provoke vomiting. Bismuth salts and arsenicals circulated as remedies in various preparations. We don't have a perfect ledger of every dose he swallowed. We do know the pharmacy of the era was generously sprinkled with substances we treat as toxic today. Add, too, incidental sources: preserved wood, rat poisons of the period, dyes in clothing and drapes, uncontaminated foodstuffs. None of these alone prove exposure. Taken together, they create a background hum of arsenic that would surprise modern audience, and would turn up, unmistakably, in hair. Critics of the environmental explanation sometimes counter with a list of human suspects. Perhaps a disloyal attendant slipped powder into wine. Perhaps a British plot removed the emperor neatly, avoiding the mess of old age. When we test these theories against the rhythm of Napoleon's decline, the fit is poor. An assassin's dose would create a thunderclap, days of violent illness, not years of postprandial pain and progressive wasting. To stretch arsenic into a quiet, chronic killer, we'd have to imagine very small, repeated doses that never once triggered the dramatic gastrointestinal crises arsenic is famous for. At that point, the assassin's method looks a lot like wallpaper. There's also the problem of access. Longwood was full of watchful eyes. Napoleon's meals and drinks passed through hands that recorded and gossiped. Any deliberate program of poisoning would have required a conspiracy across the very people who, after the emperor's death, wrote and testified and argued about him into old age. Plotters who stay silent forever are convenient in novels, real ones tend to talk. Let's widen the lens to the family. Napoleon's father died relatively young with a wasting stomach illness. Accounts from close relatives mention gastric troubles. Modern medicine recognizes hereditary diffuse gastric cancer syndromes, though nobody can retroactively genotype the Bonapartes. What we can say is that a family pattern, plus the classic symptoms, plus an autopsy pointing squarely at gastric malignancy, equals a straightforward diagnosis. What about the other suspects you sometimes hear, mercury from medicines, kidney disease, or a grand foodborne plot? Mercury from calomel and other compounds certainly could have harmed him. But mercury intoxication has its own constellation of neurological and behavioral signs, tremors, excessive salivation, character changes, that don't define Napoleon's final years. Kidney disease can cause nausea, vomiting, and weakness, but the autopsy's focus on the stomach lesion, with adhesion and ulceration, is hard to ignore. Food poisoning is typically acute and episodic. It doesn't explain a multi-year decline capped by a large, malignant mass at autopsy. There's another useful forensic lens: dose makes the poison, and duration tells the story. Arsenic measured in hair mostly reflects chronic exposure accumulated over weeks to months. Elevated levels in strands from before Saint Helena say arsenic was around him for a long time, in various places, in small amounts. A murderer's hand is not required to explain that. A century packed with arsenic is. So we arrive at a simple, uncomfortable truth. The idea of a deliberate poisoning will always be seductive because it makes the ending dramatic, because it turns a slow disease into a plot with villains and reveals. But the sober weight of evidence points, again and again, to cancer. Consider the narrative that doesn't thrill, but fits. A man with a family history of stomach illness lives for years with dyspepsia that turns to pain, then to vomiting and weight loss. He eats less and bleeds a little, then more. On examination after death, doctors find a stomach deformed by a large ulcerated cancer, with walls thickened, the organ stuck to the liver, and signs of hemorrhage. This man's hair shows arsenic, as many men's hair of his century would, because the world around him contained arsenic in fashionable colors, in medicines, and in the guts of damp houses. He was not murdered. He was unlucky, in heredity, in environment, in the century he inhabited. If you visit Longwood House today, guides will point out the famous rooms. You'll see the bed's placement, the study where dictation happened, the small details everyone argues about. Was the chair here or there? Did he prefer this cup or that one? What you can't see is the invisible chemistry that breathed through that space, spores on paint, pigments in fibers, air that carried small insults every day. You also can't see a tumor growing cell by cell, a slow arithmetic, until it owned the body that had once owned empires. It's worth a moment on how we weigh evidence across centuries. We love the modern lab result, a number that looks decisive. But numbers live in context. Hair arsenic is a useful biomarker, not a verdict. The autopsy description is not a number, but it speaks the language of anatomy that hasn't changed. Symptoms are still symptoms. Put them together, an autopsy that reads like a textbook case of gastric cancer, a clinical course that matches it, environmental arsenic that explains hair results without implying murder, and the case settles. Even those who champion alternate theories often end up reshaping the same facts to fit a different story. Some say a slow, deliberate microdosing explains the lack of dramatic arsenic symptoms. Others blame specific individuals close to Napoleon. But those claims ask us to throw out parsimony. If a simple, well-supported diagnosis explains the cause and the anatomy, and a ubiquitous environmental exposure explains a lab finding, we don't need to invent a more complicated path. Does that mean arsenic was harmless in Longwood? Not at all. Environmental exposure may have worsened nausea, irritated the stomach, and generally made a sick man sicker. The same goes for the medical practices of the day: strong purges, metallic remedies, irregular dosing. It's painful to imagine a patient with gastric cancer receiving treatments that likely aggravated his symptoms. But that pain isn't a scandal, it's a reminder of how medicine grows by error and revision. There's a final human piece to hold. Napoleon was an architect of enormous suffering, wars that spent lives like coins. He was also, in his end, a person in one room, asking for relief, trying to sleep, shivering in a climate that got into his bones. The mystery of his death isn't a puzzle box we have to pry open for entertainment. It's a set of clues that, properly read, gives us empathy for how people die when their time and their medicine are against them. So where do we land? On the balance of evidence, Napoleon died of stomach cancer. The hair arsenic is real, but best explained by environmental exposure common to his era: fashionable green pigments in damp rooms, medicinal compounds, and incidental contact. The autopsy is the anchor. The symptoms are the tide that led to it. Poison makes for a gripping script, cancer makes for a truer one. If you found this careful, step-by-step reading of the evidence helpful, subscribe. This channel takes historical controversies and cleans the lens. We separate myth from forensics, romance from records. Next time, we'll follow a secret network that turned murder into ritual.